So it's very exciting to be here. I'm kind of slowly waking up, so that's that. But so today I'm going to talk about part of a new project on influencers and content creators that I've been working on for the past 3 years. And specifically, I'm going to be talking about a kind of articles that came out of this project entitled "The Influencer Pay Gap: Platform Labor Meets Racial Capitalism," which I've been doing with Yingden Liu, who is a PhD candidate in my department. So let me start with a little bit of background. We've been talking about this already, but over the past decade, influencers and content creators more broadly have become more and more visible on social media, with different genres, norms, and formats multiplying. In the kind of content creation space, a growing numbers of influencers are making a living or complementing their income by monetizing their social media production in a variety of ways. One of the main ways in which influencers monetize their social media creation is through sponsored content, namely kind of contracts that they develop with brands for advertising purposes. So where, for example, I'm going to be sponsoring kind of this brand and saying that it's amazing, that I really like it, and I'm going to be talking about that to my followers, and in exchange getting paid by the brand in order to do that. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, over the past couple of years, there have been a growing number of scandals and kind of revelations in which influencers have vocally complained about being discriminated against by brands, and especially, so, two main dimensions, one in terms of gender, but second, and perhaps most importantly, in terms of race and ethnicity. And so influencers have been talking about how, for example, Black influencers who are vocal about Black Lives Matter and matters of social and political kind of concerns makes them less likely to get paid by brands. And so we decided to kind of study this question, which, in many ways is not a new question. It's the question of kind of precarity and inequality in platform labor has been studied on a range of platforms, and research, both qualitative and quantitative, have found that platforms tend to reproduce and create new forms of inequality among digital workers. And in recent years, this kind of framework has developed to include kind of scholarship on racial capitalism. And here I'm thinking in particular of Tracy McMillan Cotton's recent article on this, where she argues that basically platforms function by kind of creating or relying on a type of what she calls predatory inclusion, where they present themselves as a kind of equal opportunity, democratic employers, or not employers, but intermediaries that can provide new avenues for kind of economic opportunities, especially for racial and ethnic minorities, low-income ethnic and racial minorities, when in fact kind of incorporating these new kind of categories of workers on an extractive basis, and not in fact giving them the means to survive with the kind of platform labors that they do, which then encourages them to kind of hustle for more. And certainly this kind of framework in terms of racial capitalism and predatory inclusion can be applied to the case of social media creation pretty nicely, especially since, as we know from Brooks' work and several other people's work in that domain, we know that social media influencers and creators in general suffer from a large certain amount of uncertainty and precarity in the kind of work that they do for social media platforms, and that in this kind of working conditions, dynamics of inequality and discrimination also take place. So this is kind of the framework we're working with here. And what's interesting in kind of making sense of resistance and of discrimination and inequality among platform laborers is that very often platform laborers, such as influencers, are kind of resisting, or at least complaining and being vocal about what they're experiencing through social media campaigns, right? So relying on platforms themselves as a way to complain about the ways they're being treated by platforms. And this is where our site comes in. So we're studying this Instagram account called the Influencer Pay Gap, which was created in April 2020 by Adesuwa Ajayi, who is a marketer who worked with influencers at several agencies, and then created the account as a space to crowdsource influencers' highest paid collaborations with brands. As soon as she created the account in which kind of influencers sent her the highest paid gigs that they got, and with some kind of information, as you can see here, right? There is typically like gender, race, metrics, and then like the highest paid contract that they got for sponsored content. The account kind of went viral and soon attracted more than 60,000 followers. Ajayi, over the course of a year and a half, shared more than 1,000 posts that she crowdsourced from influencers about their paid collaborations. And so we took this crowdsourced account as a source of data. And we asked, based on this data, what are the racial dynamics shaping compensation and employment opportunities among social media influencers? Now, obviously, this data set has a lot of limitations, and I'll talk a bit about that at the end of the presentation. So what we did is we rely on mixed methods with a kind of quantitative component in which we crawled all the publicly available information on the account, so all the posts that had been crowdsourced and shared and anonymized by Ajayi. Then we collected a range of information about these posts on different dimensions, which you can see here, and we ended up with a subset of about 660 Instagram exchanges that were posted by 549 unique influencers. And so then we started kind of looking at this data a bit more carefully, and based on the analysis that we have, what did we find? Well, we document three main findings, which I'm going to talk about very quickly today. The first one, which I find really interesting, is that when looking at how much influencers get paid and comparing these kind of declarations of revenues by influencers to industry templates, and I'll say more about this in a second, we found that influencers, in fact, receive lower payments than what industry literature leads them to believe. While most of the influencers in our sample received some kind of monetary payment, it was much lower than these estimates. So here what we did is we compare the reported data from the influencers, which you can see here. I think the median is $140 per sponsored post, right? So that's kind of the median rates that influencers in this sample received. And then we compared it to two industry templates in industry publications that say, oh, if you're an influencer, how much should you charge for sponsored content? And, you know, a first formula is, oh, you should charge your number of followers multiplied by 0.01. And the second one is, oh, you should charge your number of followers times 0.04. And what we see is that compared to these two industry templates, in fact, the reported data from the influencer pay gap crowdsourced information is significantly lower. And here you can see the error bar on the two industry templates on the right. So that's kind of the first finding. So basically, what we find is that the way in which marketers and agents and kind of industry specialists are representing the kind of economic opportunities that influencers can get. It's kind of a disingenuous pictures because, in fact, based on our sample, the actual rates are much lower. Second findings is about the fact that, so basically social media metrics and mostly number of followers and engagement rates are essential in determining pay and rates for influencers. And so the way in which the industry talks about metrics is typically like, oh, this is fair, right? Because the way in which you're going to get paid really depends on the number of followers and the engagement rates that you're getting on your account. So you can't really be discriminated against since it all depends on fair, objective, and accurate metrics, right? Well, turns out these metrics, in fact, can be interpreted in a racialized light. And that's kind of what we found in kind of doing a more qualitative analysis of the posts that are being shared on the account. And here, for example, you see this post, like, oh, sorry, I wanted to send this on a burner account. I have to remain anonymous. This is an industry insight. Brands want results. Sadly, statistics shows that Black influencers are not able to deliver the results. sales, followers, etc., that white influencers are able to. This is why Black influencers are approached to do free gigs. It's because the company won't really lose. And then much more on that, like I agree, it's not politically correct, but the truth is a white audience is the key to success. So here what we see is a version of what economists, for example, call statistical discrimination, right? So using metrics in this case to justify paying influencers less because they're Black, typically like Black following is seen as less valuable to advertisers than the white following of white influencers. So even though metrics are often kind of presented as a fair way to justify payments, in fact, they can be racialized in this way. And finally, we turn to what we call the compensation and negotiation gap, and we compare how much white and influencers of colors are getting paid. And basically what we find is that first, in our sample, non-white and influencers of colors are getting paid less in the sense that they're less likely to receive monetary compensation, they're less likely to receive products and discounts, and they're more likely to receive no compensation. Now you'll notice that these differences are pretty small, right? So we're not making a big deal out of it, they're non-significant, but it is kind of an interesting way in which the kind of rates are being and the payments are being distributed. Second, and perhaps more importantly for our purposes, we also find what we call a negotiation gap. So also, so basically on the influencer pay gap, what we find is that influencers are always calling other influencers to advocate for themselves, lean in and negotiate with brands to know their worth and, you know, really kind of advocate for themselves. And that's the way to kind of end discrimination in social media careers. Turns out this is not exactly the solution, because what we find is that influencers of colors, in fact, are significantly more likely than white influencers to negotiate with brands, so to try to push back against the initial offers that brands make, right, at least in the sample. But at the same time, they are less likely than white influencers to see these negotiations succeed, right? So to engage in a negotiation with brands and to see as an outcome of this, the rate of the payment being improved and the kind of transaction following through. And so here we found multiple examples of that, but we kind of reproduce one exchange that was kind of shared with Angèle on the account, where it's like, you know, this influencer on the right was trying to push back and ask for payment with a brand. And the brand was like, oh, with all due respect, we couldn't take you on as a paid influencer. It's just because the majority of your followers are fake. However, we still reach you to give you an opportunity to join the family for free, obviously, right? Engaging in free work. So there is not only a negotiation and compensation gap, but perhaps more importantly, a negotiation gap here. So the last aspect to this is that even when influencers and influencers of color are successful in negotiating with brands, and when the transaction and the contract go through, in fact, they still have to chase after brands in order to get paid. And so this is kind of another post in which, you know, I've sent them 5 invoices, they've opened and read all of them, but still haven't paid me. Any advice on what to do? I feel cheated and not sure what to do. Black female influencer, etc. And so this kind of like kind of hurdles in the kind of implementation of contracts is also a big part of what's kind of creating not only friction, but also difficulties, especially for, shall we say, the more precarious influencers in the samples. So, you know, summing up and trying to kind of give more time for the discussion, we document, based on our analysis of the influencer pay gap sample, a couple of key findings. The first one is that the rates reported by influencers are significantly lower than what industry templates say that influencers are making, right? So, so there is a bit of a difference here. Second, even though metrics are, you know, generally presented, especially by marketers and agents, as like a fair and objective way, of determining how much influencers will get paid. In fact, they are also interpreted in a racialized light, and in a way in which, the metrics of especially of influencers of colors, and especially Black influencers, are seen as less valuable than the metrics of white influencers. And third, we find that there is a gap in compensation, which is non-significant, but more importantly, in negotiations in our samples, in the sense that influencers of colors are more likely than white influencers to try to negotiate with brands, and yet they're less likely to see their negotiations succeed, right? So basically, they're kind of doing more work to try to get paid their worth and failing more often. And then when it fails, or even when it doesn't fail, they also kind of are chasing and are getting like all of these kind of abusive emails, etc. So not a perfect situation. So what are the implications of these findings? Here I'd like to kind of note a couple. The first one is that I think that, Tracy Macmillan-Cotton's framework of predatory inclusion in social media creation applies pretty nicely to the case we're finding here, in the sense that, many of the influencers who post content on the influencer pay gap account or share content with Angèle and then, get this content kind of like reposted anonymously on the account, kind of are emphasizing that, they turn to social media in part because it was another avenue for economic success, right? And that's certainly a message that platforms are themselves advocating, when they're saying, anyone can be a YouTuber. This is a democratic, or an Instagrammer, or anyone can be an Instagrammer. Just work hard, do what you're doing, and if you're popular, if you're successful, you'll be able to, to charge and to get paid your worth, right? And so what we find is that, not really, in the sense that first, you're getting paid much lower rates than what the industry and often platforms are kind of talking about. And obviously this is only for sponsored content, not for monetized videos. So typically on YouTube, it would be a bit different. And so that's why we're mostly focusing on Instagram here. But that's kind of a first kind of high level kind of finding in which kind of this framework of predatory inclusion is relevant for the study of social media careers, in spite of platforms kind of high-level points on this. Second finding is that, in spite of the advice among influencers to rely on individual negotiation tactics to achieve parity and lean in, right, to echo Sheryl Sandberg's book, but more generally kind of advice that, especially for women of color, is like, oh, women of color don't ask, and therefore, if only they asked, they would get paid the same as men, as what it meant. Well, it turns out not really, as we see in these findings. Asking is not enough. And finally, and so I'm happy to talk more if there are questions about what are some of the variables or some of the factors driving this kind of uneven outcomes in negotiation tactics. And finally, we kind of end with a more methodological note, I guess, which is that this kind of crowdsourced data is an interesting opportunity to examine platform labor, right? So in a context where platforms are not sharing the data, and where most of the research on platform workers and social media influencers in this case is qualitative, we can rely on these kind of new forms of forums and kind of online groups and social media campaigns that are being developed by platform workers to get some kind of sense of the distribution of opportunities among them. Now, of course, and that's kind of what I announced at the very beginning of this presentation, this is non-representative data, in the sense that, the data that we get is completely determined by the origin of the account, the kind of positionality of the creator of the account, and this Angèle, who is a Black woman and a marketer. And so that means that, basically the influencer who submitted information to be crowdsourced on the account are part of the network of Angèle, or like, friends of friends or followers of followers. And so they're much more likely, for example, to be kind of politically involved and to be already aware of inequalities in social media creation, right? So we're not talking about influencers at large here. But yet, again, in the absence of other information and other available data, about rates for influencers, we argue that this is a first way to try to understand what's happening in this rapidly growing sector of the economy. That's it. Thank you.